lost in the icy wilderness. The wind on Solstice 9 was a living force, a creature of endless winter that swept across the frozen plains, hungry and merciless. It howled through jagged cliffs and shallow valleys, a constant presence of frigid brutality that claimed any warmth it touched. In the heart of this unforgiving land, Serafina stumbled forward, her blue skin nearly translucent against the white expanse. Each step left a fleeting impression in the snow, only to be erased by the wind moments later, as if her very existence were an afterthought in this vast wilderness. Serafina's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, each inhalation feeling like shards of glass sliding into her lungs. Her once vibrant skin, a soft, luminescent blue that had always set her apart, now seemed dull and faded. Her hair, wild and untamed, was a brilliant pink, a shock of color against the bleak landscape, but even it was matted with frost and ice. Despite the bitter cold, she felt a warmth deep within her, a faint flicker of life that fought desperately against the elements. She had been abandoned here, left to the mercy of the planet's unyielding winter. Her stepmother, Lady Verin, had stood just a few paces away when she delivered her final, scornful words. "You never belonged here, Serafina. You never belonged anywhere." Dressed in layers of fur and steel, Verin had looked as though she were carved from the ice itself, her pale skin and piercing eyes a mirror of Solstice 9's harsh beauty. With a single dismissive wave, she had turned her back, leaving Serafina to face the storm alone. As Serafina staggered, her vision blurred and the edges of the world grew dim. She was losing strength quickly. Her hands clenched at her sides, trying to muster some last reserve of energy, but the cold was an enemy she could not fight alone. Her mother's words echoed faintly in her mind, a whisper from a memory long past. "Your warmth is a gift, Serafina. Never let anyone take it from you." But now, her warmth was slipping away, draining into the snow beneath her feet. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees, the biting cold of the ice seeping through her skin. The distant lights of Izera, the domed city, shimmered faintly on the horizon, a world she would never see again. Just as darkness began to close in, a strange sensation rippled through her. It was a warmth, faint and fragile, but unmistakable. She lifted her head, her silver eyes barely open, and saw a flicker of light in the distance, moving through the storm toward her. It grew brighter, closer, until a figure emerged from the swirling snow, a man wrapped in thick layers, his face obscured by a fur-lined hood. As he knelt beside her, she felt his strong hands lift her, the warmth of his body pressing against her frozen skin. His voice, low and gentle, pierced through her fading consciousness. "Stay with me," he murmured, pulling her close. "You're not alone." The world tilted and spun, the wind howling as though it were angry at this intrusion, but the man held her firmly. The scent of wood smoke and spice enveloped her as he carried her through the snow, his stride steady and sure, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Serafina felt the stirrings of hope. A shelter of survival. When Serafina awoke, warmth enveloped her, a sensation so foreign it felt almost like a dream. She blinked, her vision slowly adjusting to the dim glow of firelight flickering against wooden walls. The storm outside had quieted to a soft murmur, a distant howl that sounded as if it were a world away. She lay wrapped in thick woolen blankets, her skin tingling as it thawed, a gentle reminder that she was still alive. "Easy there," a low voice murmured, and she turned her head to see the man who had saved her. He sat nearby, crouched by the fire, his face shadowed but his eyes bright, with a fierce, steady focus. "Drink this." He handed her a mug filled with steaming broth. The scent was rich and spicy, filling her senses and making her realize just how hollow her body felt. She took it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, and warmth bloomed from the contact. Cautiously she sipped, the liquid spreading through her chest like a bomb, igniting a flicker of life within her. "Who?" Her voice was raspy, her throat dry. She swallowed and tried again. "Who are you?" The man leaned back slightly, the firelight dancing across his rugged features. His hair, a deep, wind-tossed brown, framed a face that seemed as weathered as the planet itself. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, seemed to hold a deep-seated wariness, but there was also a kindness there, a softness she hadn't expected to find on this merciless world. "Caden," he said simply. "Just Caden. And you're lucky I found you out there. That storm would have taken you for sure." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "What were you doing out there alone?" Seraphina's mind raced. She could feel the weight of his question, laced with genuine curiosity, but also caution. Trust was a rare commodity on Solstice 9, and she knew she couldn't afford to reveal everything. Still, there was something about Caden's gaze that made her feel safe. "My stepmother," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "She left me out there, to die." Caden's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he looked away, gazing into the flames. "People don't survive out there alone," he muttered, more to himself than to her. When he turned back to her, his eyes were fierce. "Well, you're safe now. She won't find you here." The word hung in the air, almost as if it were a fragile illusion, something that could be shattered by the faintest touch. Safe. It was a word Seraphina hadn't heard in so long it felt foreign, almost meaningless. Solstice 9 was a planet where survival was bought with sweat and struggle, where kindness was a commodity most couldn't afford. Yet here she was, alive and sheltered, saved by a stranger who owed her nothing. A sudden noise cut through the silence, a low, mournful howl that made the flames flicker. Seraphina tensed, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her heart racing. Caden's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of a knife at his belt, his entire body taut with alertness. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice clipped. He moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent his life on the edge of danger, every muscle coiled and ready. Seraphina watched as he stepped toward the cabin door, his movements swift and quiet. The storm outside had grown louder, the wind battering the small cabin with renewed fury. Shadows danced across the frost-rimmed windows, casting eerie shapes that seemed to shift and sway with the rhythm of the blizzard. Seraphina's mind raced with possibilities, memories of whispered tales she'd heard as a child, of creatures that roamed the ice, shadows that took shape in the snow, beasts that hunted the unwary. As the door closed behind Caden, she felt an ache in her chest, a strange emptiness that hadn't been there before. The warmth of the fire seemed to dull, and she huddled closer to it, wrapping herself tightly in the blanket, as though it could shield her from the reality outside. Minutes passed, each one stretching out in silence, filled only by the muted roar of the storm. She strained to listen, her senses on high alert, her mind playing tricks as she imagined every possible danger that could be lurking beyond the cabin walls. Her mother's words drifted back to her, a gentle echo from a time when she had felt loved and protected. "Your warmth is a gift, Seraphina. Never let them take it from you." The thought gave her strength, and she straightened, her silver eyes glinting with renewed determination. She was not the helpless child her stepmother believed her to be. She had survived against all odds, endured in a world that had tried to break her at every turn. She wouldn't let fear steal that from her now. At last, the door opened, and Caden slipped back inside, his face flushed from the cold, his eyes shadowed with tension. He shook off the snow that clung to his coat, brushing it away as he set his knife down beside him. "False alarm," he said, his voice low. "Just some glacial wolves. They're getting bold this season, but they haven't figured out how to get past walls yet." He attempted a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes, and Seraphina could see the exhaustion that weighed on him. "Do you always stay so calm when staring down death?" she asked, the hint of a smile playing on her lips despite the tension that still gripped her. Caden chuckled, though the sound was more a release of tension than genuine amusement. "Death and I are old friends," he replied, settling onto a stool near the fire, his gaze steady. "But you?" He looked at her, his expression thoughtful, almost intrigued. "You're a mystery. I didn't expect to find someone like you out there. Serafina felt a pang of unease, a reminder that her very existence was an anomaly in this place. She had always been different. Her blue skin, her glowing eyes, her untamed hair, all things that had marked her as an outsider, a target. But here, with Caden's gaze fixed on her, she felt an unfamiliar sense of acceptance. "What do you mean, someone like me?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Caden hesitated, his eyes flicking over her as if weighing his words. "You're different. Not just the way you look, but something else. Most people wouldn't survive alone out there, but you did. That says something." For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the faint roar of the storm outside. Serafina felt an odd sense of calm settled over her, a fragile peace she hadn't known in years. Here, in this small cabin, surrounded by the cold that had almost claimed her, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for: trust. The wind outside battered the walls, but inside, for the first time, she felt safe. The secrets of Solstice 9. The days passed in a strange rhythm. The storm outside ebbed and flowed, sometimes roaring against the cabin like a living thing, sometimes falling to a whisper as if it were merely gathering strength. Inside, Serafina and Caden settled into an uneasy companionship, bound together by survival and silence. They spoke little, sharing meals and warmth by the fire, their words few that weighted. And yet, with every passing hour, an unspoken bond began to take shape, an understanding that words alone couldn't express. Caden had ventured out at dawn, as he did every morning, returning with fresh snow melting on his coat and a bundle of sticks and supplies strapped to his back. Serafina watched him as he worked, his hands skillful and efficient as he tended to the fire, repaired the cabin, and gathered whatever sparse resources the land offered. His movements were practiced, almost ritualistic, as though he'd done this countless times before. She couldn't help but wonder about him, about the life he'd led on this hostile planet, and the dangers he'd faced to survive. "Why do you stay here?" she asked one evening, her voice soft but curious. She sat across from him, her legs curled beneath her as she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, the fire casting flickering shadows on her face. Caden looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he seemed to consider her question carefully, his gaze distant, as though seeing something she couldn't. "Solstice 9 has a way of growing on you," he said finally, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe I've just grown on it. Either way, I know how to survive here." "Surviving isn't the same as living," Serafina replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. Her mind drifted back to Isera, the domed city, a place where life was regimented, controlled, a place where survival came at the cost of freedom. Caden's smile faded, his expression becoming serious. "There's more to life than just comfort and safety. Out here, you find out what you're made of." His eyes softened, and he leaned forward, the firelight casting shadows on his face. "But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Serafina's cheeks flushed with indignation. "I know more about surviving than you think," she replied, her tone sharp. "I wasn't given the luxury of choice, Caden. My life was taken from me. Everything I was, everything I could have been, was twisted and used against me. And when I wasn't useful anymore, I was discarded." The words spilled out before she could stop them, a torrent of bitterness and pain she had kept buried for so long. She looked away, feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. But Caden didn't flinch. Instead, he watched her, his expression one of quiet empathy. "Everyone's got scars, Serafina," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Some of us just hide them better than others." For a long moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken words. Outside, the wind moaned against the walls, a sound that seemed almost mournful, as if the planet itself were bearing witness to the secrets they'd kept hidden. Finally, Caden spoke, his voice low and steady. "There's something you should know about Solstice 9, he began, his eyes never leaving hers. "The storms here, they're not just weather. They're alive in a way. This planet has a pulse, a rhythm. It's why the Dome City is so heavily fortified. They can't explain it, so they lock it away." Serafina frowned, her curiosity piqued. She had always known there was something strange about the storms, something almost sentient in the way they moved, the way they seemed to seek out the weak and the vulnerable. But to hear it spoken aloud, to hear someone acknowledge the eerie truth she had always sensed, sent a chill down her spine. "Alive," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Caden leaned back, his gaze distant. The storms are drawn to emotion, pain, fear, anger, anything that gives off energy. It's why they're so strong around the Dome City. All those people, trapped in one place, all their fears and resentments, it feeds the storm. Out here, it's different. There's a balance, a kind of understanding. But it's fragile, and it's easy to upset. Serafina shivered, her mind racing with the implications of his words. If what he said was true, then her very presence here, her pain, her anger, could be drawing the storm closer, endangering them both. She looked away, guilt gnawing at her heart. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to. You could have left me out there, and no one would have blamed you." Kagan was silent for a long time, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and earnest. "I helped you because I've been where you are, Serafina. I know what it's like to be abandoned, to feel like you're nothing more than a burden." His eyes softened, a hint of sadness flickering in their depths. "No one deserves to face this world alone." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and comforting. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, precious thing that seemed to glow softly in the darkness. They lapsed into silence once more, but this time it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding. Serafina watched the fire flicker, its light casting warm hues on the walls, and felt something within her shift, a tiny spark that refused to be extinguished. But as she sat there, cocooned in warmth and companionship, a soft hum began to vibrate through the floor, faint at first, but gradually growing stronger. She tensed, glancing at Caden, whose face had gone taut with tension. "What is that?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Caden's expression was grim as he rose to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. "It's the storm," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's different this time." Before she could ask what he meant, the cabin shuddered. The very walls seemed to vibrate with a force that was more than just wind. The fire flickered and dimmed, casting the room into shadows, and Serafina felt a chill creep over her, a sense of dread that settled deep in her bones. Caden moved to the window, his jaw clenched as he peered outside. The storm was unlike anything she had ever seen, a swirling mass of shadows and light, twisting and churning with an intensity that seemed almost alive. Lightning crackled within its depths, illuminating strange, shifting shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. "Stay back," Caden warned, his voice tense. He turned to her, his eyes fierce. "Whatever happens, don't let it get inside your head. The storm, it can sense weakness. It feeds on it." Serafina nodded, her heart pounding as she clutched the blanket tightly around her shoulders. She could feel the storm's pull, a strange, insidious force that seemed to reach out to her, whispering promises of warmth and safety, of release from the pain that had haunted her for so long. But she wouldn't give in. Not now, not when she had come so far, not when she had found someone who understood her struggle. She straightened, her silver eyes blazing with determination, and met Caden's gaze. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice steady. Caden's expression softened, a faint smile breaking through his tension. "Good," he replied, "because fear is exactly what it wants." Together, they stood side by side, watching as the storm raged outside, a tempest of shadows and light that seemed to stretch endlessly across the frozen landscape. The wind howled, The cabin shuddered, but inside, they were a small, defiant beacon of warmth and strength, a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be broken. And as they stood there, Serafina felt something within her ignite, a fierce, unyielding resolve that burned brighter than the storm. She would survive this, they both would, and together, they would face whatever darkness awaited them on Solstice 9. Shadows in the snow. The storm raged well into the night, an unending roar that wrapped around the cabin, pressing against it like a living thing, testing its walls for weakness. Inside, Serafina and Caden barely moved, each consumed by their own thoughts as they listened to the relentless fury outside. It was as if the storm itself had become a beast, clawing at the walls, seeking a way inside. When the first rays of dawn began to filter through the frost-covered windows, Caden finally stirred, his muscles tense as he rose and peered outside. The storm had settled, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence in its wake. Outside, the landscape was transformed, a blank, endless expanse of untouched snow, as smooth and featureless as a frozen lake. But something about it felt wrong. "It's too quiet," Caden muttered, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "Storms don't usually calm this quickly. It's like—" He trailed off, a dark look crossing his face. "Like it's waiting," Serafina finished, shivering as she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She could feel it too, the heavy, ominous presence that lingered in the air, as though the storm were merely biding its time, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Caden nodded, his expression grim. "We need to be ready. There's a place nearby, an outpost that used to be a supply station before it was abandoned. If we can make it there, we might find more supplies and some answers." Serafina's heart raced at the thought of leaving the relative safety of the cabin, but she knew he was right. Whatever this storm was, it wasn't natural, and staying here would only delay the inevitable. She met Caden's gaze, her silver eyes glinting with determination. "Then let's go." They packed quickly, gathering the bare essentials, a few blankets, the knife, and what little food they had left. Caden slung a small pack over his shoulder and handed Serafina a sturdy pair of boots he'd found in a corner of the cabin. They were too big, but she tied them tightly, grateful for the added protection against the snow. She could feel her strength returning, a newfound resilience that gave her the courage to face whatever lay beyond those walls. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them like a wall, sharp and unyielding. The air was thin, biting into their lungs with every breath, and the snow crunched beneath their feet as they trudged through the endless expanse. The sky above was a pale, washed-out gray, a color so devoid of warmth it seemed to seep into their bones. They walked in silence, their footsteps the only sound in the otherwise still landscape. Serafina glanced at Caden from time to time, her mind racing with questions she hadn't dared to ask. She barely knew him, yet he had saved her life, shared his shelter, and was now leading her into the unknown. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, secrets he kept hidden beneath that calm, unyielding exterior. After what felt like hours, the outline of a building appeared on the horizon, a dark shape against the blinding whiteness of the snow. The outpost was little more than a squat, low-roofed structure, half buried in snow and ice. Its metal walls were weathered and rusted, and the windows were dark, giving it an abandoned, forgotten feel. Serafina's heart sank as they approached, the silence pressing down on her, a weight that seemed to grow with each step. "Are you sure there'll be supplies here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caden's expression was unreadable. "If we're lucky, but that's not the only reason we're here." He glanced at her, his eyes shadowed. "This place, it has a history. People came here looking for answers, for a way to understand Solstice 9. Some of them never returned." A chill ran down Serafina's spine, and she couldn't help but look around, as if expecting to see ghostly figures emerging from the snow. "And you think we'll find something useful here?" He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the darkened windows of the outpost. "I think it's worth the risk." They reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. Caden pushed against it, his muscles straining as he forced it open, the metal creaking and groaning in protest. The door finally gave way, and they stepped inside, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. The interior of the outpost was cold and dark, the air thick with dust and the faint, lingering scent of rust. Empty crates and equipment were scattered around, remnants of a time when this place had been alive with activity. A large map hung on one wall, faded and torn, showing the layout of Solstice 9 with several points marked in red. Serafina ran her fingers over the map, her curiosity piqued. What were they looking for? Caden's voice was barely a whisper. They were looking for the heart of the storm. They believed it was something more than just weather. Something alive. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She could feel it too, the strange, almost sentient quality of the storm, the way it seemed to respond to her emotions, her fears. It was as if the storm had a will of its own, a purpose that went beyond mere nature. They moved deeper into the outpost, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. In the back room, they found a small stash of supplies, canned food, blankets, and a box of flares. Caden gathered them quickly, stuffing them into his pack, his movements quick and efficient. But as Serafina reached for a flare, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a small device, sleek and unfamiliar. She picked it up, examining it closely. It was a small, circular object with a single button in the center, a faint blue light glowing from within. "What is this?" she asked, holding it up for Caden to see. He froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the device. "That is a tracker. They must have left it here to monitor the storm's movements." He reached out, taking it from her and studying it closely. "If we can activate it, it might help us understand the storm's patterns. Maybe even give us a warning before it hits." Serafina watched as he examined the tracker, his face tense with concentration. "Do you think it could explain what's happening? Why the storm feels so alive?" Caden didn't answer immediately. He pressed the button, and the device hummed to life, emitting a soft, pulsing light. The screen flickered, displaying a series of coordinates and a moving line that seemed to follow an invisible path. "This storm, it's not just weather," he said quietly, his voice filled with a grim determination. "It's something much older, something that's been here long before the Dome City was built. And if we're going to survive, we need to understand it." The realization settled over them like a weight, a dark certainty that left them both silent. They gathered the rest of the supplies and made their way back to the entrance, stepping out into the harsh light of day. But as they prepared to leave, a sound reached them, soft at first, but growing louder, a low, keening wail that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Serafina's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She looked at Caden, her eyes wide with fear. What is that?" He didn't answer, his face pale as he turned, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And then she saw it, a dark shape moving toward them, a swirling mass of shadow and light that seemed to shift and change with every step. It was the storm, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen. It moved with purpose, its tendrils reaching out like fingers, clawing toward them with an almost desperate hunger. "Run!" Caden shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her forward, his voice barely audible over the roar of the approaching storm. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the snow as the storm surged toward them, a force of nature that was neither alive nor dead, but something in between. Serafina could feel it behind her, a cold, insistent presence that pressed against her back, urging her to stop, to give in, to surrender to its icy embrace. But she wouldn't. Not now, not when she had come so far. She clenched Caden's hand tighter, her resolve hardening as they sprinted across the frozen wasteland, the storm hot on their heels. They reached the cabin just as the first tendrils of the storm brushed against them, a searing cold that burned her skin like fire. Caden shoved her inside, slamming the door shut behind them, the walls shuddering as the storm battered against them, an unrelenting force that seemed determined to break through. They stood in silence, their breaths ragged, their bodies pressed against the door as if their very presence could hold the storm at bay. The cabin creaked and groaned, the wind howling outside like a beast denied its prey. For a long moment, they stood there, their bodies tense, their hearts racing as the storm raged outside, a relentless force that seemed almost personal. But Serafina wasn't afraid. She met Caden's gaze, a fierce determination shining in her silver eyes. "Whatever this is," she whispered, her voice steady, "we'll face it together." And as the storm battered against the walls, she felt a strange, unyielding warmth fill her, a fire that burned brighter than the storm, a resolve that would not be extinguished. She would survive this. They both would. And together, they would uncover the secrets that lay buried in the heart of Solstice 9. Whispers of the past. As the storm gradually receded, the silence that followed was so absolute it felt suffocating. The cabin walls creaked, settling back into place, but the memory of the storm's relentless force lingered in the air, like the fading echoes of a nightmare. Serafina sat by the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, while Caden paced nearby, his face lined with concern. Though they had survived another onslaught, the storm had left an impression on both of them, its eerie power more than just the threat of cold. The strange tracker they had found at the outpost lay on the table, its faint blue light casting a ghostly glow across the room. It pulsed slowly, in time with some unknown rhythm, as though it were alive. Serafina couldn't help but feel that the device was watching them, studying them as they tried to decipher the strange patterns on its screen. "Tell me more about this storm," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said it's alive. But how? And why does it seem drawn to us?" Caden stopped pacing, his gaze fixed on the tracker. He was silent for a long moment, his face shadowed with memories that seemed to haunt him. "Solstice 9 wasn't always like this," he began, his voice low. "When settlers first came here, they thought they'd found a frozen wasteland, a place they could control, exploit. They didn't understand the land or its storms. And then, people started disappearing." Serafina's heart quickened, her eyes widening as she listened. "Disappearing? Where did they go?" Caden shook his head. "No one knows. They would go out into the storms, and they just never came back. Some thought they'd frozen to death, lost in the snow. Others believed the storms had taken them." He paused, his gaze distant. "But a few of us, those who've lived here long enough, believe there's something more to it, that the storms are alive in a way, and that they have a purpose." Serafina shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She could feel it too, that strange, sentient quality of the storm, as though it were watching them, judging them. But why? What did it want? "Do you think it's connected to this?" She gestured toward the tracker, its pulsing light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Caden nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It could be. This device was meant to monitor the storm's movements, to study its patterns. But I think it does more than that. I think it's linked to the storm somehow, like it's a part of it, or a piece of its consciousness." The idea was both fascinating and terrifying. Serafina leaned forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "Then maybe we can use it. Maybe we can understand what the storm wants." Caden looked at her, his eyes filled with both admiration and concern. "Are you sure? This storm, it's not something you can reason with. It doesn't follow the rules we're used to. It's older than us, older than anything we know." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But I can't keep running from it. We need answers." He nodded, respect evident in his gaze, and picked up the tracker. The device's blue light flickered, as though in response to his touch, and a soft hum filled the room. Serafina leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the screen as the light grew brighter, illuminating a series of strange symbols that began to scroll across the display. What is that?" she whispered, her heart racing as she studied the symbols. They were like nothing she had ever seen, fluid and intricate, shifting and changing with each beat of the light. Caden's brow furrowed. It's ancient. I've seen symbols like this before, in old records buried deep in the archives of Isera. They called it the language of the land, a script that was said to belong to those who came before us. The first ones. Seraphina's pulse quickened. The first ones, you mean, other settlers? No, his voice was barely a whisper, something older. There were stories, legends of beings who lived here long before humans arrived. They spoke of creatures made of ice and storm, spirits who could shake the weather with a thought. People called them the Solstice Guardians. Most believed it was just a myth, a tale to explain the harshness of the planet. But after all I've seen, I think there's truth in it. The implications were staggering. If these guardians were real, then the storm was more than just a natural phenomenon. It was an expression of something alive, something sentient. And if the tracker was truly connected to it, then it meant they were holding a piece of that ancient consciousness in their hands. "What do you think it wants?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Caden shook his head. "I don't know, but there are records that suggest the storm only reacts to those it perceives as threats. Maybe it sees us as intruders, invaders in a land that isn't ours." The words stung, a reminder of the life Seraphina had left behind. She had always been an outsider, marked by her differences, by her alien features that set her apart from everyone around her. But here, in this harsh land, she felt a strange kinship with the storm, as though it too were a creature that didn't belong. "I need to understand it," she murmured, her silver eyes fixed on the tracker. "If there's any way to communicate with it, to show it that we mean no harm." Caden looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and fear. "You're braver than most, Seraphina. But this is a risk. If the storm senses us, it might respond in ways we can't control." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But I have to try. I won't let fear control me anymore." With a nod, Caden placed the tracker in her hands, his gaze unwavering. The device seemed to react to her touch, its light growing brighter, the hum intensifying until it resonated through her entire being. She closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythm of the light, the pulsing beat that seemed to match her own heartbeat. And then, in the depths of her mind, she felt something shift, a presence, vast and ancient, stirring like a giant awakening from slumber. It was cold and distant, yet strangely familiar, as though she were reaching out to a part of herself she'd had forgotten. "Who are you?" The question was a whisper, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in a long-forgotten forest. Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the presence reaching out to her, probing her mind, testing her resolve. She forced herself to remain calm, to open herself to the connection. "I am Seraphina," she thought, her mind trembling under the weight of the presence. "I come in peace. I want to understand." The silence stretched on, tense and unyielding, as the presence seemed to consider her words. She could feel its cold, calculating mind sifting through her memories, her fears, her hopes, as though weighing her soul against some unknown standard. "You are not like the others," the presence finally replied, its voice a deep, resonant echo that reverberated through her very being. "You carry warmth, a warmth that does not belong here." The words struck her like a blow, a reminder of her own alien nature, of the life she had left behind. But she held her ground, refusing to let the presence intimidate her. "I only wish to understand," she replied, her mind steady. "Why are you here? What do you want?" There was a long pause, and then slowly the presence responded, its voice filled with a sorrow that felt as old as the stars. "We were the first, the guardians of this land. We were bound to it, our souls woven into the ice and snow, our purpose to protect and preserve. But your kind, they did not understand. They came with fire and iron, and they took from us, piece by piece, until only shadows remained." A deep sadness filled her heart, a sense of loss that went beyond words. She could feel the pain of the guardians, their sorrow at watching their home destroyed by those who didn't understand its beauty, its fragility. "I am sorry," she whispered, her mind filled with regret. "I didn't know." The presence softened, its anger melting away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. We do not seek vengeance. We only wish to be remembered, to be honored. If you truly understand, then you will carry our memory forward so that we are not forgotten. Serafina's heart swelled with a sense of purpose, a vow forming within her soul. "I will remember. I will carry your story. You will not be forgotten." The presence lingered for a moment longer, a soft, spectral warmth that filled her with a sense of peace. And then slowly it faded, slipping away into the depths of her mind, leaving her with a feeling of calm she hadn't known in years. When she opened her eyes, Caden was watching her, his expression filled with wonder and respect. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Serafina took a deep breath, her silver eyes shining with a newfound clarity. "They were here long before us, Caden. The storm, it's a part of them, and all they want is to be remembered." Caden nodded slowly, his gaze filled with understanding. "Then we'll honor them. We'll carry their memory, just as you promised." And as they sat together in the quiet of the cabin, the storm finally fell silent, leaving behind a land bathed in peace, a land where the memory of the guardians would live on through those who truly understood. The silent covenant. The days following her connection with the storm passed in a hushed stillness, as if the land itself had taken a long, quiet breath. The usual winds that rattled the cabin and carved deep scars into the snow had stilled, replaced by a peace that seemed almost reverent. Serafina moved with a new sense of purpose, her steps lighter and her heart steadier, though her mind was heavy with the promise she'd made to the guardians. Caden, too, seemed different, his usual wariness softened as though he, too, felt the weight of the silent covenant they now carried. Each morning, they'd prepare for the journey they had chosen to undertake, the journey to the place where the heart of the storm lay. It was a location marked faintly on the ancient map they'd found in the outpost, a place that had been labeled only with a symbol that looked almost like an eye. This was where they'd find the answers, and perhaps a way to preserve the legacy of the Solstice Guardians. On the third morning, as the sun cast long, ghostly shadows across the snow, they prepared to set out. Caden packed their sparse supplies in a large bag strapped to his back, while Serafina held onto the tracker, its pulse now a steady, comforting rhythm that seemed to guide them forward. The storm, which had once threatened them, now felt like a companion, a silent force watching over them, as though acknowledging the promise they carried. "This place we're going to," Kagan said as they began their trek, his voice low. "There's almost no record of it in Isera, just old legends. People say it's where the storms are born." Serafina nodded, the words resonating deeply within her. She could feel it too, a tug, faint but unmistakable, pulling her toward that place, a whisper urging her forward. "I think it's where the guardian spirits are strongest. They're calling us there for a reason." Their journey took them across a vast, frozen expanse that stretched endlessly in all directions. The landscape was hauntingly beautiful, the snow glistening under the pale sunlight, each step leaving a crisp imprint in the undisturbed whiteness. But there was something else too, a feeling that they were walking through a graveyard, but beneath the snow lay the memories of those who had come before, those whose voices had been silenced by the ice. As the hours passed, Serafina became more aware of the strange stillness in the air. It was as if the storm was waiting, holding its breath, the way an audience might hush before a performance. Her mind drifted back to the words the guardians had whispered to her, the sorrow and dignity with which they had shared their memories. "Caden," she said softly, breaking the silence, "what do you think will happen when we reach the heart of the storm?" Caden glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly, I don't know, but I think it'll change us, maybe even change this place. The guardians, they don't want vengeance, they just want acknowledgement. If we give them that, maybe they'll find peace." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate within her. It was a simple thing they sought, remembrance, to be honored not as myths or shadows, but as the rightful protectors of this land. It was a purpose she could understand, a purpose she could believe in. The terrain grew harsher as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the snow giving way to jagged cliffs and ice fields that glistened like broken glass under the sunlight. The air grew colder, each breath a plume of mist that hung in the air, a reminder of their fragility in this harsh environment. At last, as the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm, golden glow over the frozen landscape, they reached the edge of a vast, ice-covered plateau. In the distance, a massive chasm cut through the land, a gaping maw that seemed to descend endlessly into darkness. Seraphina's heart raced as she gazed at it, sensing that this was the place they had been seeking, the heart of the storm. The tracker in her hand pulsed faster, its light brightening as they approached the edge of the chasm. The air was thick with a strange, electric energy, a hum that vibrated through her bones, filling her with a sense of awe and trepidation. It was as if the land itself were alive, breathing in rhythm with her own heartbeat. Caden moved closer, his face sullen as he looked down into the chasm. "This is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The heart of Solstice 9. They stood in silence, gazing into the depths, each of them feeling the weight of the moment, the gravity of the promise they had come to fulfill. The chasm seemed to watch them, a silent sentinel that had waited lifetimes for this moment, for someone to acknowledge its existence, to honor its guardians. Seraphina took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, sharpening her senses. She held out the tracker, its pulsing light casting a soft glow over the edge of the chasm. Closing her eyes, she reached out with her mind, feeling for the presence of the guardians, the ancient spirits who had once walked this land. "We are here," she thought, her heart filled with both fear and hope. "We remember you." The response was immediate, a wave of warmth that surged through her, a sensation so powerful it took her breath away. She felt the presence of the guardians, a vast, ancient force that seemed to surround them, filling the air with a quiet strength, a timeless wisdom that defied words. Caden's face softened as he, too, felt the presence. His eyes closed, and a peaceful smile crossed his lips, as though he were communing with the spirits himself, his mind open to their message. The ground beneath them trembled, a faint rumble that grew steadily stronger, until the entire plateau was vibrating with the energy of the guardians. Seraphina held her breath, her heart pounding as the tracker's light grew brighter, illuminating the chasm with a brilliant, ethereal glow. And then a voice filled her mind, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet. "You have come. You have remembered." The words filled her with a sense of joy and reverence, a feeling she couldn't explain. She could feel the guardians' gratitude, their relief at being acknowledged, their souls released from the sorrow that had bound them to this land. "Thank you," she thought, her heart filled with a profound respect. "We will carry your memory forward." The presence of the guardians began to recede, the energy around them softening, the vibrations subsiding. But before they faded completely, Seraphina felt one final thought, a whisper of hope that lingered in her mind, a message meant for her alone. "You are more than you know, Seraphina. Your warmth is a gift, a legacy of the stars. Cherish it, and it will guide you." The words echoed in her heart, filling her with a sense of purpose, a reminder of her own uniqueness, her own strength. She was not just an outsider, not just a creature of cold and light. She was something more, something that transcended the boundaries of Solstice 9. When she opened her eyes, she found Caden watching her, his face filled with a quiet awe. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They're at peace now," she replied, her voice steady. "They've passed on, and we have a part of them with us." He nodded, his expression softening as he reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. Together, they stood at the edge of the chasm, gazing into the depths, feeling the presence of the guardians settle into a quiet, eternal rest. As they turned to leave, Seraphina felt a strange sense of clarity, a certainty that she'd have found something worth cherishing, worth protecting. She had come to Solstice 9 as an exile, an outcast. But now she was leaving as something more, as a keeper of memories, a bearer of light. With Kaden by her side, she took her first steps away from the heart of the storm, her heart filled with a quiet joy, a sense of peace that would guide her in the days to come. And as they walked away, the chasm behind them filled with light, a final tribute to the Guardians, a reminder that they would never be forgotten, their legacy forever woven into the fabric of Solstice 9.